remember the coincidence he talked about, that I was invited to accept an honorary doctorate in law at Notre Dame University in Indiana, in the United States, and to my surprise I saw on the program, before I saw him, that Professor Joshua was graduating with his earned doctorate, and I remember feeling a little ashamed that I was getting it the easy way and he had to get it the hard way. But that brings back very warm memory. So the topic that I've been asked to address is whether the return on the investment in the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has paid off. In order to answer that question, I think one's got to look at where international criminal law has come from and where it is today. You'll, I hope, bear with me if I deal briefly with some of that history. 17 years ago is not a long time in anybody's life, really. I suppose if you're 17 years old, then it's a long time back. But for those of us who are a little bit more than 17, it's not really a very long time. But 17 years ago, there was no such subject as international criminal justice. If you'd have asked somebody what they thought about international criminal justice, they would have said inevitably, what is that? And you wouldn't have been able to tell them. The modern international criminal justice began, I suppose, with Nuremberg, but then it went into slumber, if not almost a permanent sleep, between 1945 and 1993, when the Security Council surprisingly set up the first ever truly international criminal court for the former Yugoslavia. Nuremberg was not an international court. It was a multinational court set up by the victorious nations, and similarly Turkey. But the former Yugoslavia tribunal was truly an international court with judges, originally 11 judges coming from 11 different countries on 4 continents, prosecutors and registrar staff coming from all over the world. When I left after 2.25 years, towards the end of 1996, in the prosecutor's office we had collected a staff of over 200 from about 50 countries. And it wasn't very dissimilar in the Rwanda tribunal, which in those days had the prosecutor's office in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. So it was a surprise that the Security Council set up these 2 international criminal courts, when it had always been anticipated that this would only happen by treaty, that countries would agree to come into a system such as has been set up for the International Criminal Court. But the reason for the International Criminal Court, there can be no doubt, were the successes of the ad hoc tribunals and some of the so-called hybrid tribunals, particularly that for Sierra Leone. But what were the successes of the ad hoc tribunals that preceded the International Criminal Court? The first, and in my view most important, is the one always forgotten, and that is that those first tribunals in the middle 1990s established what was sometimes doubted by many people. They established that an international criminal court could have a fair trial. Many people, many well-meaning supporters of international criminal justice, doubted whether you could get judges and prosecutors and staff coming from civil law systems and common law systems and other systems, whether they could really come together and organize and put on a trial that could be judged fair by the international community, and particularly the international legal community. But that's now beyond question. There's criticisms here and there of this or that trial. But I've heard or read no serious suggestions that the trials in The Hague, whether for the ICTY or in Arusha for the Rwanda Tribunal, the ICC, there's no question that the trials have been fundamentally fair. And people have an odd view about that. I remember after I had already left the Yugoslavia tribunal, the first successful appeal was handed down. And the appeal chamber of the Yugoslavia tribunal overturned a conviction by the trial chamber. Headlines in all the newspapers, setback for international justice. I mean, in my book, it was a win for international justice. You judge the fairness of any judicial system, particularly a criminal judicial system, not by the convictions, but by the acquittals. And the fact that the appeals chamber of the ICTY reversed guilty finding by the trial chamber was a win, not a loss. The judges were doing their duty. And I think in the ICC already, the judges in the Lubanga case, the first case where there's been a judgment thus far, it's taken a long time, unfortunately, and that's one of the problems I'll come to. The judges certainly put the fairness of the trial as their paramount consideration. So that was the first success. The second important success was effectively the withdrawal of impunity for war criminals. Until the Yugoslavia Tribunal and the successor courts, and particularly the ICC, war criminals did not fear justice because there wasn't any. There was no court other than domestic courts that could put them on trial. And unfortunately, if you look back in history and even in today's world, war criminals, when they are at home, are usually regarded as war heroes. And there has been complete impunity for war criminals. Well, that has been withdrawn by modern international criminal justice. The third and very important success has been the advance of international humanitarian law, what used to be called the law of war. Until it was used for the first time, really, in 1994, 1995, in the Yugoslavian and Rwanda tribunals, and now in the International Criminal Court, the law was of no practical consequence. So there wasn't a law school in the world that taught international criminal law, because there wasn't any. The law of war, as it was then called, the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Regulations and the Genocide Convention and Crimes Against Humanity, were taught not in law schools, but in army colleges in some of the democracies, so that soldiers would know what the law expected of them. But the law stagnated, because if you don't use law, it stagnates, it doesn't advance. And as I said earlier this evening in a different context, it's to the great credit of the International Committee of the Red Cross that they kept on updating the Geneva Conventions and commenting on the law of war and interpreting it. It was only when the judges started using it in actual real cases that came before them in the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals that the law advanced. The most obvious area of advance has been in respect of gender crimes. When I arrived in The Hague in the middle of 1994, systematic mass rape was not recognised as a war crime. It had been perpetrated for centuries in many parts of the world. But the humanitarian law didn't acknowledge it. I've no doubt the reason for that was the law was written for men, and gender crimes were regarded like pillage as some inevitable consequence of war. But the law neglected what should have been obvious, and that was in some wars, systematic mass rape had been used as a means of making war. It was a strategy used by evil leaders as a means of waging war. And